The city hummed outside, a distant, indifferent beast. Inside, Elias stood before a fractured mirror, its silvered surface a mosaic of his own fragmented reflection. Each shard held a piece of him, a tired eye, a grim line around his mouth, the faint tremor in his hand as he adjusted his grip on a worn dumbbell. For months, perhaps years, a quiet, relentless pressure had been building within him. It wasn't a physical ache, but a profound internal dissonance, a sense that the life he meticulously constructed was now a costume he'd outgrown, suffocating him with its familiar threads. He lifted the weights, the rhythmic exertion a desperate attempt to anchor himself to something tangible, something real. Each rep was a silent question, echoing the unspoken truth that the ground beneath his feet no longer felt solid. The goals he once chased, the relationships he nurtured, now felt hollow, like he'd been running towards a destination that was never truly his. Carl Jung, a name Elias had stumbled upon in a late-night search for answers, spoke of such periods, times when the psyche accumulates tension in silence, reorganizing itself beneath conscious awareness before erupting into sudden, total transformation. Elias saw it in the broken mirror, not just his reflection, but the fractured reality of his existence. He was not imagining it, this unsettling sense of impending change, this feeling that something enormous was approaching. His unconscious had already made a decision his conscious mind hadn't caught up to yet, and what came next, he knew, would change everything. If you, like Elias, feel this profound shift, this quiet tremor before the earthquake, then you're not alone. Join us as we explore the journey of transformation. Subscribe now to follow Elias's story and unlock insights into navigating your own inevitable shift. The sweat dripped from Elias's brow, blurring the fractured image in the mirror even further. He dropped the weights with a thud that resonated through the quiet apartment, a sound swallowed by the city's endless drone. His muscles ached, a familiar burn that, for once, offered no comfort. The physical exertion, usually a reliable escape, now only amplified the internal tremor. He felt like a pendulum, pulled to an extreme, and the inevitable swing back was gathering force, threatening to shatter the fragile peace he'd maintained for so long. Jung called this enantiodromia, the principle that when anything in the psyche reaches its extreme, it transforms into its opposite, not slowly, but suddenly, violently. Elias had lived a life of meticulous control, a carefully constructed facade of competence and calm. He was the reliable friend, the diligent employee, the man who always had an answer. But beneath that polished surface, a different force had been building, a yearning for something wilder, more authentic, something he had systematically suppressed. Now, that suppressed opposite was demanding its due. He walked to the window, looking down at the ant-like figures scurrying below. Their lives seemed so clear, so purposeful. His own felt like a play he was no longer rehearsed for, the script suddenly alien. The job that had once defined his success now felt like a gilded cage. The friendships, once a source of belonging, now felt like obligations, requiring a performance he was too exhausted to give. Nothing external had truly changed, yet internally, the psyche had reached its limit. The one-sidedness of his existence had become so extreme that the opposite force, the true self he had buried, was finally breaking through. This wasn't a breakdown, though it felt terrifyingly close to one. It was, as Jung would describe, the self initiating a correction. His conscious personality had wandered too far in one direction, too rigid, too identified with a version of reality that no longer served his deeper development. The discomfort wasn't illness, it was the psyche doing exactly what it was designed to do, dismantling what had become a cage. The preparation for this felt entirely underground, like tectonic plates shifting deep beneath the Earth's surface. For years, nothing visible happened, the landscape looked stable, but pressure was accumulating along fault lines no one could see. Now, the earthquake was arriving, and Elias felt it in every fiber of his being. He remembered a dream from the previous night, vivid and unsettling, a vast, dark ocean rising, threatening to engulf the familiar cityscape. It wasn't frightening, but strangely peaceful, a sense of inevitable cleansing. Jung paid extraordinary attention to dreams, considering them direct communications from the unconscious. Elias's dream was the unconscious telling him, in its own language, that his inner world was restructuring itself, and the outer world was about to follow. The transformation that was about to happen in his life didn't start yesterday, it started years ago. Every time he silenced an instinct, every time he stayed in a situation that violated his integrity, every time he performed a version of himself that kept others comfortable while slowly killing something authentic inside him. Another crack formed along the fault line. He didn't feel it happening because he was too busy managing the surface. But underneath, the forces of transformation were gathering. The loss of meaning he'd been experiencing, the strange detachment from things that once mattered, wasn't a sign of depression, but a withdrawal of energy. His psyche was reclaiming the energy it had distributed across his old life, needing it for what was coming next. The emptiness wasn't loss, it was reallocation. Something inside him was gathering its resources for a massive shift. The most unsettling sign, however, was the collapse of tolerance. He suddenly couldn't stand things he'd endured for years. The superficial conversations, the unspoken expectations, the constant need to please. Not because something dramatic happened, but because his psyche had decided that the cost of maintaining these arrangements now exceeded the cost of disrupting them. The unconscious had done its math. The equation no longer balanced, and his sudden intolerance was the first visible sign that the internal restructuring had reached the surface. This phase, Jung warned, was extraordinarily dangerous. Not because the transformation itself was harmful, but because people panic when it begins and make catastrophic mistakes. They try to force everything back to normal, or they act impulsively, blowing up their lives without true internal change. Elias felt the pull of both mistakes. The urge to cling to the familiar, to pretend everything was fine, warred with a desperate impulse to burn it all down. But a deeper instinct, perhaps the nascent true self, urged caution. He knew he couldn't force the old meaning to return, nor could he discharge this immense energy through external drama. The real work, he sensed, was internal. It was about staying present with the discomfort, without trying to fix it, flee from it, or force it to resolve on his timeline. This required a specific kind of courage, the courage to not know, to sit in the space between who he was and who he was becoming, without demanding that the process speed up or slow down. This was the tension of opposites, the space where real transformation happens. The old self was losing its grip, the new self hadn't fully formed, and he was suspended in the middle, feeling like he was nothing and no one, belonging nowhere, fitting into nothing. This space, Jung said, was where the real work happened, not in the dramatic moment of change, but in the unbearable waiting that preceded it. Elias was in that waiting room, the air thick with anticipation, the echo of the broken mirror reflecting not just his past, but the promise of a future he couldn't yet see. If Elias's journey resonates with your own unspoken feelings, if you find yourself in this liminal space between what was and what is yet to be, there's more to uncover. Don't navigate this profound shift alone. Subscribe to our channel to continue following Elias's story and gain deeper insights into Jungian psychology that can illuminate your own path through transformation. Your true self is waiting. Elias sat on the edge of his bed, the city lights painting faint geometric patterns on his wall. The weights lay forgotten in the corner, symbols of a discipline that once felt like control, now just another discarded relic of his old self. He was in the unbearable waiting, a phrase from Jung that resonated with a chilling accuracy. The old identity, the carefully constructed persona of the capable, composed man, was dissolving, not with a bang, but with a slow, agonizing fade. He felt like a ghost in his own life, observing rather than participating, a spectator to the unraveling of everything he once believed himself to be. Jung spoke of this space as the crucible where the true personality is born, something qualitatively different from the performed self that came before. Elias grappled with this concept. What did it mean to be true? Had he ever truly been himself? He replayed moments from his past, the forced smiles at corporate events, the polite agreements in conversations he found tedious, the suppression of his own desires to accommodate others. Each memory was a tiny shard, reflecting a life lived for external validation, a constant performance to earn approval. The thought was both liberating and terrifying. Liberating because it explained the profound emptiness he felt, terrifying because it meant he had to shed layers of himself so deeply ingrained they felt like his very skin. The first whispers of this true personality were subtle, almost imperceptible. He noticed a growing indifference to what others thought of him. A colleague's casual criticism, which once would have sent him spiraling into self-doubt, now barely registered. This wasn't arrogance, but a quiet internal shift, a nascent sense of what Jung called psychological sovereignty. The need to be liked, approved of, included, was being replaced by something deeper, a burgeoning relationship with himself that didn't require anyone else's permission. It was a strange, unsettling freedom, like learning to walk again after years of being carried. He still loved, he still connected, but the contortions, the bending of his own shape to fit others' expectations, were becoming impossible. His body, his mind, simply refused. Then there were the shadows. Jung's concept of the shadow, the unacceptable parts of oneself hidden in the unconscious, had always intrigued Elias. He had always prided himself on his rationality, his calm demeanor. But beneath that, a wellspring of anger, a fierce ambition, a raw, untamed sexuality had been buried. He recalled a recent incident, a minor bureaucratic error at work, something he would have calmly rectified before. This time, a surge of irrational fury had coursed through him, startling in its intensity. He hadn't acted on it, but the sheer force of the emotion had been a revelation. It was a glimpse of the unacceptable parts, demanding to be seen, to be integrated. He wasn't pretending to be good anymore. He was beginning to acknowledge the full spectrum of his human capacity, the potential to be gentle and fierce, generous and boundaried, compassionate and ruthless, depending on what the situation demanded. This wholeness, this individuation, felt radically different from the one-dimensional goodness he had performed for so long. The path was fraught with peril. Jung had warned that people often panic during this phase, making one of two catastrophic mistakes: trying to force everything back to normal or acting out impulsively. Elias felt the magnetic pull of both. There were days he yearned for the comfortable numbness of his old routines, the predictable rhythm of a life he understood. He'd catch himself almost reaching for his phone to call an old friend, to re-engage in a conversation he knew would feel hollow. And then there were the moments of explosive frustration, the urge to quit his job, to sever ties, to burn bridges in a dramatic, liberating blaze. But something held him back. The memory of Jung's words, conscious suffering, echoed in his mind. He had to stay present with the discomfort, to witness what was dying without clinging to it, to feel the grief of what he was releasing without letting it pull him backward. This conscious suffering was not passive resignation, but an active engagement with the internal process. It was the courage to not know, to sit in the space between who he was and who he was becoming, without demanding that the process speed up or slow down, to let the old identity dissolve without immediately grabbing for a new one. He was suspended in the middle, feeling like he was nothing and no one, belonging nowhere, fitting into nothing. Yet, in this profound disorientation, a strange sense of alignment with fate began to emerge. Not fate in some mystical, predetermined sense, but the recognition that his life had a trajectory his conscious mind hadn't designed. Looking back, the suffering wasn't random. The detours weren't mistakes. The things that felt like they were destroying him were actually dismantling the false structures that stood between him and who he was meant to become. This was why Jung said, "Sudden transformation feels like destruction while it's happening, but looks like destiny in retrospect." While he was in it, all Elias could see was what he was losing, the identity that was dissolving, the relationships that couldn't survive his growth, the life that no longer fit. But a quiet voice, deep within, suggested that everything that fell away needed to fall away, that his psyche wasn't destroying his life. It was clearing space for the life that was actually his. The loneliness was profound, but it was also a necessary solitude, a space for the internal work to unfold without external interference. He was learning to trust the process more than his fear, a deep, grounded recognition that the pressure he felt had purpose. The journey was far from over, the destination still shrouded in mist, but Elias felt a nascent strength, a quiet resolve he hadn't known he possessed. He was navigating the crossing from who he was to who he actually was, and the only preparation that mattered was the willingness to let the old self go, to stop white-knuckling the identity he'd outgrown. If you're walking a similar path, feeling the weight of the unlived life and the promise of a true self emerging, know that this journey, though solitary, is universally human. Don't miss the next chapter of Elias's transformation. Subscribe now to continue this profound exploration of self-discovery and find guidance for your own unfolding destiny. The city outside Elias's window was waking, but he felt more awake than the city itself. The unbearable waiting had given way to a new, unsettling phase. The subtle tremors had intensified, and the ground beneath him was no longer merely shifting. It was actively breaking apart. Jung had compared this to an earthquake, sudden and total, where everyone thinks it came from nowhere. But Elias knew better. He had felt the pressure accumulating, the fault lines forming deep within his psyche for years. Now, the visible landscape of his life was beginning to conform to the internal upheaval. The relationships that couldn't hold who he was becoming were indeed falling away. His long-standing friendship with Mark, built on shared routines and unspoken assumptions, had become strained to the point of silence. Mark, comfortable with the old Elias, found the new, quieter, more introspective version unsettling. Conversations felt forced, punctuated by awkward silences. Elias no longer had the energy to perform the enthusiastic, agreeable friend Mark expected, and the unspoken tension was a constant, dull ache. He grieved the loss, but a deeper part of him understood that this dissolution was necessary. The psyche wasn't destroying his life, it was clearing space. The environments that required the old version of him were becoming intolerable. His job, once a source of pride and stability, now felt like a prison. The corporate jargon, the endless meetings, the performative enthusiasm, it all grated on his newly sensitive nerves. He found himself staring blankly at spreadsheets, the numbers meaningless, his mind consumed by an internal dialogue far more urgent than quarterly reports. The patterns that had kept him safe when he was smaller, the need for external validation, the fear of conflict, the constant striving for approval had stopped functioning. He had outgrown the safety they provided, and now they felt like shackles. This was the moment Jung spent his life studying, the moment before everything breaks open, when the accumulated pressure of years of unconscious development reaches the surface and demands conscious participation. Most people who found themselves here thought something was ending. Elias, armed with Jung's insights, understood something was beginning, something that required the death of who he thought he was in order to reveal who he had been becoming all along. He couldn't prepare for this in any conventional sense. He couldn't stockpile strategies or rehearse responses or build defenses against a force that was coming from inside his own psyche. The only preparation that mattered was the willingness to let the old self go. He stopped white-knuckling the identity he'd outgrown. He stopped performing the life that no longer had his energy behind it. He accepted that the disorientation he felt wasn't a problem to solve, but a passage to move through. This acceptance was not easy. There were moments of profound fear, a primal terror of the unknown. He would stand before the broken mirror, not to exercise, but to simply gaze at his fragmented reflection, searching for a coherent image, a glimpse of the man he was becoming. Sometimes he saw only the fear in his eyes, the uncertainty etched around his mouth. Other times, a flicker of something new, something resolute, would emerge from the chaos of the shards. Jung believed that the people who navigate sudden transformation successfully share one quality. They trust the process more than they trust their fear. This wasn't blind trust, nor passive acceptance. It was a deep, grounded recognition that the psyche is intelligent, that the pressure he felt had purpose, that what was dissolving needed to dissolve, and that what would emerge on the other side would be more real, more whole, and more alive than anything the old self could have constructed. This was what it meant to prepare himself, not gathering armor against the change, but gathering the courage to stand undefended while the change moved through him, letting it dismantle what must be dismantled, letting it reveal what had been hidden, letting it rearrange his life according to a blueprint his conscious mind never drew, but his deeper self had been holding all along. The dreams intensified, becoming even more vivid and symbolic. He dreamt of ancient forests being cleared by an unseen force, making way for new growth. He dreamt of shedding old skin like a snake, leaving behind a brittle, empty shell. These weren't nightmares. They were communications, the unconscious mind speaking in its rich, symbolic language, guiding him through the internal restructuring. He began to keep a dream journal, a tangible record of the subterranean shifts, finding a strange comfort in their cryptic messages. They were proof that he wasn't going mad, but rather undergoing a profound, natural process. Elias understood that the timing wasn't his to control. The psyche had its own intelligence and its own schedule. He couldn't force himself to transform faster because he was uncomfortable with the waiting, nor could he slow it down because he was afraid of what was on the other side. The unconscious had already determined the trajectory. His job wasn't to direct the transformation. His job was to stay conscious while it happened, to witness what was dying without clinging to it, to feel the grief of what he was releasing without letting that grief pull him backward, to remain present in the disorientation without numbing himself against it. This staying conscious was what separated people who were transformed by crisis from people who were simply damaged by it. The crisis itself was neutral. It was a force of psychological nature, neither good nor bad. What determined the outcome was whether he met it with awareness or fled from it into unconsciousness. And fleeing didn't always look like avoidance. Sometimes it looked like frantic activity, constantly doing, planning, fixing, solving, anything to avoid sitting still long enough to feel the full weight of what was shifting inside him. Elias resisted this urge. He allowed himself moments of stillness, of simply being with the discomfort, the fear, the profound sense of not knowing. He was learning to trust that the psyche knew what it was doing, that it had been preparing for this far longer than he had been aware of it. The transformation that was coming wasn't going to ask his permission, it was going to happen because it must. Everything was about to change suddenly. Not because the external world was shifting, although it might, but because the internal world had already shifted, and external reality always eventually conforms to what's happening inside. Elias was standing at the precipice, feeling the wind of change whip around him, the old world crumbling behind him, and a vast, unknown landscape stretching out before him. He was ready to step into it, not with certainty, but with a quiet, fierce courage. If Elias's journey through the earthquake of transformation resonates with your own experience, If you feel the ground shifting beneath your feet and the old structures of your life giving way, there is strength in shared understanding. Don't face this monumental shift alone. Subscribe to our channel to witness the culmination of Elias's story and discover how to navigate your own path through profound change, emerging more real, more whole, and more alive. The city outside Elias's window was no longer a distant beast. It was a vibrant hum, a symphony of life he now felt connected to, rather than alienated from. The broken mirror, once a symbol of his fragmentation, now reflected a man who, though still bearing the marks of his journey, stood with a newfound coherence. The earthquake had passed, leaving behind not destruction, but a transformed landscape, both within him and around him. The relationships that had fallen away were replaced not by emptiness, but by space for authenticity. He found himself drawn to new connections, people who resonated with the emerging, truer version of himself, unburdened by the expectations of his past. His conversations were deeper, more genuine, fueled by an honesty he had once feared. The environments that had felt suffocating now seemed to recede, their power over him diminished. He hadn't quit his job impulsively, but a quiet, internal clarity had emerged, guiding him towards a path more aligned with his true purpose, a path he was now ready to explore with deliberate intention. This was the culmination of what Jung described as the birth of the true personality. Elias was no longer performing, he was simply being. The psychological sovereignty he had glimpsed was now a grounded reality. He organized his life around his own inner compass, not out of selfishness, but because the transformation had burned away the part of him that believed his worth depended on external validation. He could still love, still connect, but he no longer contorted himself into shapes designed to make others comfortable. The need to be liked, approved of, included, had been replaced by a deep, unwavering relationship with himself that required no one else's permission. The integration of his shadow was an ongoing process, but he no longer feared the darker aspects of his nature. The anger, the ambition, the raw impulses were not suppressed but understood, acknowledged, and channeled constructively. He was whole, which meant he had access to his full range of human capacity. He could be gentle and fierce, generous and boundaried, compassionate and ruthless, depending on what the situation demanded. This wholeness, this individuation, was a profound liberation, allowing him to live with a richness and depth he had never known. Looking back, Elias saw the pattern for the first time. The suffering wasn't random. The detours weren't mistakes. The things that felt like they were destroying him were actually dismantling the false structures that stood between him and who he was meant to become. The sudden transformation had felt like destruction while it was happening, but now, in retrospect, it looked like destiny. Everything that fell away needed to fall away. His psyche hadn't been destroying his life. It had been clearing space for the life that was actually his. He had survived the crossing from who he was to who he actually was. He had accumulated enough experience, enough conscious suffering, enough awareness to navigate the profound shift. He hadn't fought it, he had let it carry him. And in surrendering to the transformation, in letting the old life die so the real one could begin, he finally understood what it meant to be fully, terrifyingly, beautifully alive. The disorientation had given way to a profound sense of belonging, not to a place or a group, but to himself. Elias now understood that the journey of transformation is not a destination, but a continuous unfolding. The psyche, in its infinite wisdom, is always moving towards wholeness, always seeking alignment with the deepest truth of who we are. He had learned to listen to its whispers, to trust its intelligence, and to embrace the ongoing process of becoming. The broken mirror, still in his apartment, was no longer a source of pain, but a reminder of the profound journey he had undertaken, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. Prepare yourself. Everything is about to change suddenly. Carl Jung's words, once a stark warning, now resonated as a powerful promise. Elias had prepared himself, not by building defenses, but by cultivating courage, awareness, and trust in the process. He had stood undefended while the change moved through him, letting it dismantle what must be dismantled, letting it reveal what had been hidden, letting it rearrange his life according to a blueprint his conscious mind never drew, but his deeper self had been holding all along. This is the profound journey of self-discovery, a path that awaits each of us when our psyche decides we are ready. If Elias's story has resonated with you, if you feel the stirrings of your own inevitable transformation, know that you are not alone. The insights of Carl Jung offer a powerful map for navigating these profound shifts. To delve deeper into the specific psychological mechanisms that drive sudden transformation and learn practical ways to cooperate with your own psyche, watch our next video appearing on your screen now. It will guide you through the critical steps to embrace your true self and navigate the changes that are already underway. Click the video to continue your journey.